Welcome to our sleep video series, your easiest path to drifting off naturally. These videos are designed to gently guide your mind toward rest. They work in a few simple ways. First, we give your mind something lightly engaging to focus on, not too exciting, not too dull. Just enough to keep your thoughts from wandering, but not enough to keep you awake. Next, through our proprietary neuro-relaxation technique, the pacing of the audio gradually slows as the video progresses. This subtle change encourages your mind to slow with it. The slowdown doesn't happen in a straight line. It follows carefully crafted patterns proven to support deeper relaxation. Finally, every element of the audio is intentionally calm, steady, and pleasantly boring, perfect for helping your mind settle into sleep. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe so you always have a new video ready for bedtime. And in return for these videos, we ask just one small favor. Please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, your city, state, or country, and what time it is for you. It motivates our team, helps us understand what's working, and builds a worldwide community of people who fall asleep together each night. It's always inspiring to see how others use these videos. Now, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let yourself unwind.
Chapter 1, Event Horizon. Dr. Elena Voss adjusted the neural interface crown one last time, her fingers trembling. It wasn't fear. At least, that's what she told herself as she stared into the polished reflection of the quantum core. It was the electric thrill that coursed through her veins like liquid starlight, the same adrenaline that used to hit her when she hung off a cliff face in the Andes or stood before a lecture hall of skeptical postdocs. At 35, Elena was a woman who had danced on the knife's edge between worlds. She was the bastard child of archaeology's dusty tombs and quantum physics, shimmering equations. Born in the gleaming spires of New Berlin in 2147, she had spent her childhood devouring holographic reconstructions of ancient civilizations. While other children played gravity ball, Elena was mentally walking the processional way of Babylon or shivering in the shadow of a receding glacier. History wasn't just her passion. It was her lover, her confidant, the one constant in a life upended by her recent divorce from Marcus. Marcus. She glanced at the datapad resting on the console. The divorce decree was finalized 3 days ago. Marcus, the smug chronobiologist who thought timelines could be tamed like houseplants, had called her reckless. "You don't respect the variable, Elena," he'd said, packing his collection of vintage vinyl. "You think time is a river you can swim upstream. It's a waterfall. You're going to drown." "Watch me swim," she whispered to the empty lab. The lab was her sanctuary, hidden beneath the Cascade Mountains in a bunker carved from obsidian-veined rock. There were no corporate overlords here, no prying ethics boards from the Temporal Integrity Commission. There was just her, the low, rhythmic thrum of the fusion cells, and the prototype time displacement device she called Chronos. It wasn't some bulky chamber like the old sci-fi vids from the 20th century. Chronos was portable, sleek as a gauntlet, designed to slip a single traveler through the temporal weave for reconnaissance jumps. 5 minutes into the past, harvest the localized data, and snap back before the universe noticed the mass discrepancy. Revolutionary, world-altering, hers. She glanced at the chrono display, 03, 17 a.m. Pacific Standard Fusion Time. Marcus would be sleeping in his pod across the continent, likely dreaming of perfectly linear equations. Good. This solo test was her rebellion. It was her proof that she didn't need his skepticism or anyone else's safety protocols. "One jump," she said aloud, her voice echoing off the reinforced alloy walls. "Just to verify the stabilizers." Elena strapped the Chronos gauntlet to her right forearm. It was heavy, the density of the exotic matter core pulling at her muscles. The quantum lattice glowed a soft, pulsing indigo. She synced it with the crown, feeling the familiar, invasive tingle as nanites mapped her neural pathways. Heart rate 92 BPM, adrenaline spiking, cortisol levels elevated. Perfect, she muttered. She stepped into the calibration circle, a faint grid of laser light etching the floor. The air in the room felt charged, tasting of ozone and static. She tapped the recording node on her throat. Initiating displacement sequence. Target, -300 seconds. Local hold. Her thumb hovered over the activation node. Excitement bubbled up, chasing away the loneliness that had gnawed at her for months. What if this worked? What if she could eventually go back further? What if she could touch the unmediated past, feel the wind on the steps where Cro-Magnon's first painted caves, smell the smoke of their fires? No more proxies. No more simulations. Real history. She pressed the node. The world inverted. It didn't happen like in the movies. There was no flash of light, no tunnel of stars. It was a sensation of being turned inside out. Reality folded like wet silk. Colors bled into fractals, the sterile white of the lab lights deepening to abyssal voids, the silver of the tables stretching into infinite threads of gray. Elena's stomach fluttered, a zero-G lurch that made her want to vomit, but she breathed through it, eyes closed, counting the seconds. 1, 2. The stabilizers hummed, threading her through the quantum foam. She felt the timeline resisting, a membrane pushing back against her intrusion. 3. Then catastrophe. It wasn't a sound, it was a sensation, a tearing, like a muscle snapping, but on a cosmic scale. A quantum fluctuation, unforeseen, vicious, ripped through the weave. Alarms screamed in her cochlear implant, a banshee wail that drowned out her own thoughts. Cascade failure, temporal shear detected. Abort. Abort, Elena screamed, slamming her hand on the manual release. No response. The gauntlet seared her skin, circuits frying like overcooked synapses. The smell of burning flesh filled her nose. Elena's body spun into chaos, a leaf caught in a hurricane. Vortices swirled around her, not the clean tunnel of theory, but a howling abyss of shredded timelines. Visions flashed before her eyes, strobe light fast and terrifying, skyscrapers crumbling under atomic fire. Oceans boiling away to salt flats. Herds of woolly rhinos thundering across tundras that should have been ice-free. Time was rebelling. It was bucking her like a wild beast trying to throw a rider. Pressure crushed her chest, heat licked her face. Her mind fragmented, childhood memories colliding with equations she derived at 3 a.m. Marcus's face, mocking, "You're playing with fire, Elena." "No," she gasped, the air sucked from her lungs. "I'm the fire." The agony peaked, a white-hot lance through her skull. Then impact. Chapter 2, The Green Hell. Elena hit the ground with the force of a meteorite. She didn't land, she crashed. Her body tumbled through underbrush that whipped her face raw, branches snapping against her flight suit like gunfire. She rolled, momentum carrying her down a steep slope, the world a blur of green and brown. She came to a stop in a pile of loamy soil that smelled of rot and intense, suffocating growth. For a long time, there was only pain. It bloomed everywhere. Her ribs throbbed a deep, bruising rhythm, her left ankle burned, and her right arm, where the gauntlet clung like a molten shackle, felt as if it were being consumed by ants. She lay there, staring up through the canopy. The light was wrong. It wasn't the harsh, recycled LED glow of the bunker. It was sunlight, dappled and golden, filtering through leaves that were too large, too green. "Report," she croaked. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. Silence, no AI response, no hum of the lab's ventilation. Groaning, Elena rolled onto her side and pushed up on scraped palms. The world swayed sickeningly. She retched, dry heaving into the ferns. When the dizziness passed, she looked around. No lab, no sterile walls, no Marcus. A forest enveloped her, but this wasn't the pine scrub of the modern Cascades. This was a cathedral of ancient life. Towering conifers pierced the sky, their trunks as wide as houses. Broad-leaved giants, species she'd only seen in paleobotany textbooks, spread canopies that blocked out half the sky. Ferns unfurled knee-high, and vines thick as pythons draped from limbs heavy with moss. "Where?" She yanked the neural interface crown off her head. The circuits were blackened, useless slag. She looked at her arm. The chrono's gauntlet sparked feebly, then died with a high-pitched whine. Elena clawed at it, fingers fumbling the emergency release clamps. It hissed and fell away, smoking in the dirt. She stared at it. The quantum core, the most expensive object ever created by humanity, was cracked open like an egg. Exotic matter leaked out in iridescent rivulets, evaporating the moment it touched the prehistoric air. "No power readings," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No backup beacon." She pried open the diagnostic panel with a fingernail. The internals were a mess of fused silicon. Stabilizers, vaporized, chronal anchor, severed, return protocol offline. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The silence of the forest seemed to press in, heavy and indifferent. She wasn't just lost in space, she was lost in time. "Assess," she said aloud, forcing the scientist back into the driver's seat. "Panic kills, data saves." She checked her body. Flight suit, intact ripstop fabric torn at the knees but holding. Utility belt, multi-tool analog, thank God, water purifier pen, nutrient tabs, 3 days' worth, med kit, and a vibro knife. The knife's battery indicator showed 80%. She stood up, ignoring the protest of her ribs. She needed orientation. The forest sloped upward to her left. Downhill to the right, mist clung to a valley floor. She looked at the sky. No contrails, no orbital glints of the satin-white satellites that usually webbed the atmosphere. The sun was high, maybe noon. She knelt by a patch of vegetation. Oak-like trees, but the leaves were serrated differently. Conifers dominant, no eucalyptus, no invasive species. The ground was littered with pine nuts and berries she recognized from survival sims, huckleberry analogs. A distant rumble shook the air. It was too rhythmic for thunder, too deep for a bear. "Mammals, megafauna." 10,000 BCE, she whispered, the date tasting like ash. Mesolithic, post-ice age thaw. She was 5'7" of educated flesh, in a world of fangs and flint. Water, she decided. Shelter, avoid notice. She grabbed the smoking remains of the gauntlet and shoved the pieces into her satchel. Even broken, the materials were light years beyond anything on this planet. She couldn't leave them. She began to move downhill, favoring her left leg. The air was thick, humid, laced with pollen that made her eyes water. Insects buzzed around her head, dragonflies the size of hawks, gnats that bit exposed skin. By late afternoon, the thirst was a claw in her throat. She heard running water and stumbled toward it, breaking through a wall of reeds to find a fast-moving stream. She dropped to her knees, fumbling for the purifier pen. She sterilized the water in her cupped hands and drank. It was freezing, sweet, and the best thing she had ever tasted. As she wiped her mouth, a sound froze her blood. A rustle, not the wind. Elena went still. Her hand drifted to the vibro knife. Across the stream, 30 yards away, the brush parted. A head emerged. Massive, shaggy, a wolf, but not the skittish coyotes of the 22nd century. This beast was the size of a pony, its shoulders muscled like a weightlifter, its eyes burning with a predatory intelligence. A dire wolf. It sniffed the air. It smelled the ozone on her. It smelled the blood from her scraped knees. Elena didn't breathe. The wolf stared at her, analyzing. It took a step into the water. Then a piercing sound cut the air, a shout, human and harsh. The wolf's ears flicked. It growled, a low rumble that vibrated in Elena's chest and then turned, vanishing back into the shadows. Elena let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Humans. She scrambled back from the water, retreating into the tree line. Humans meant danger. Humans in this era were territorial, superstitious, and likely hungry. But as she hid in the hollow of a rotting log, shivering as the sun began to set, another sound drifted on the breeze. Drums. Low, rhythmic thumps, and voices. She was stranded, she was alone, and she was trespassing. Chapter 3, The Capture. Night in the Pleistocene was not dark. It was a living, breathing entity. The canopy above blocked the stars, turning the forest floor into a pit of ink. Elena huddled under the overhang of a fallen redwood, clutching her vibroknife so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every snap of a twig sounded like a monster. Every hoot of an owl sounded like a signal. She dozed fitfully, waking with a start when the temperature plummeted. Her flight suit was designed for climate-controlled cockpits, not the raw chill of a prehistoric night. She curled into a ball, shivering violently. I need a fire, she thought, but fire attracts attention. She ate a nutrient tab. It tasted like chalk and sadness. When dawn broke, gray and misty, Elena forced herself to move. She needed to find high ground. She needed to see if there were any natural landmarks she could recognize, a mountain peak, a river bend, anything to correlate with her geological maps. She climbed the ridge, her boots sliding on damp moss. The physical exertion helped warm her, though her ribs screamed in protest. She reached a rocky outcrop around mid-morning. The view took her breath away. A vast green sea stretched out below her. To the east, a massive glacier gleamed in the distance, a remnant of the ice age that was slowly retreating. Below, in the valley, a river wound like a silver snake. And there, nestled in the curve of the river, was smoke. Not a forest fire, columns of thin gray smoke rising from thatched roofs. A settlement, she whispered, Natufian precursors or something else. She was watching the smoke when she heard the snap. It was close, behind her. Elena spun around, knife raised. Standing 10 feet away was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was covered in mud, wearing a loincloth of fur. His hair was matted, his face streaked with clay. He stared at her, his eyes wide. He looked at her synthetic suit, the metallic shimmer of her knife, her pale, clean skin. Elena lowered the knife slightly. "Hi," she said softly, "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He took a step back. Then he opened his mouth and let out a scream that shattered the morning silence. "Wait," Elena hissed, stepping forward. The boy turned and bolted, scrambling down the ridge with the agility of a goat. Damn it. Elena knew she should run the other way. Run deep into the woods, hide, vanish. But where would she go? She would freeze or starve within a week. Curiosity and desperation kept her rooted to the spot. Minutes later, the forest erupted. They came up the slope not with panic, but with military precision. 7 of them. Men and women clad in heavy furs and leathers, armed with spears that were taller than they were. Their faces were painted in ochre swirls. Elena backed up until her heels hit the rock face. There was nowhere to go. Leading them was a giant of a man. He had to be 6'4", towering over the others. A jagged scar ran diagonally across his chest, visible through the furs. He held a spear tipped with a massive flint point. "Karg." He stopped 5 paces from her, his chest heaving, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look like a mindless savage. He looked like a general assessing a threat. "SS ska," he bellowed, pointing the spear at her. The word was guttural, sharp demon, enemy. Elena held her hands up, palms open. She dropped the knife. It clattered on the stone. "Peace," she said, her voice shaking. "I am a friend." The rest of the group fanned out, circling her. They moved with a fluidity that was terrifying. A woman with feathers in her braided hair, Lyra, stepped forward, squinting at Elena. She held a staff adorned with bird skulls. Lyra spoke to Karg, her voice rapid and clicking. She pointed at the sky, then at Elena's suit. Karg spat on the ground. He stepped closer, the spear tip inches from Elena's throat. She could smell him, wood smoke, sweat, unwashed leather. It was the smell of pure survival. He shouted something at her, a question or a command. Elena shook her head slowly. "I don't understand." Karg snarled. He reached out and grabbed the fabric of her flight suit, yanking her forward. The material held, but the force threw her off balance. She stumbled, and another warrior grabbed her arms, twisting them behind her back. Vines were produced from a pouch, rough, biting into her wrists. They bound her tight. Elena gasped in pain, but she didn't fight. Fighting meant death. Karg looked her up and down, sneering at her strange clothes. He turned to the group and barked an order. "Crawl the village." He grabbed the tether binding her wrists and yanked. "Move," his body language screamed. Elena Voss, Ph.D., master of quantum mechanics, stumbled forward, dragged by a man who had never seen a wheel. She was no longer an explorer. She was a captive. As they marched her down the ridge toward the smoke, Elena looked up at the sky one last time. It was a beautiful, indifferent blue. "I am going to survive this," she vowed, the vine rope cutting into her skin. "I am going to survive, and I am going to make them understand." She looked at the back of the scarred giant leading her. Starting with him. Chapter 4, The Tether. The vine rope wasn't just a restraint. It was a reordering of the universe. An hour ago, Dr. Elena Voss had been an apex predator of the timeline, a woman who commanded the power of fusion cells and quantum mechanics. Now, she was livestock. The rough fiber bit into her wrists with every step, chafing the skin raw, a constant, stinging reminder that her Ph.D. meant nothing here. In the Mesolithic, the only currency was leverage, and she had none. Karg, the giant with the scarred chest, held the other end of the tether. He didn't walk, he prowled. His pace was punishing, a loping stride that ate up the uneven terrain of the ridge. He moved through the dense underbrush like smoke, branches seeming to bend around him, while Elena crashed through them, her flight suit snagging on thorns, her boots slipping on the slick, decaying leaf litter. Every time she stumbled, the rope went taut, jerking her shoulders forward with a force that popped her joints. "Slow down," she gasped, the words tearing from her dry throat. Karg didn't turn. He just gave the rope a sharp yank, pulling her off balance. She fell to her knees, the impact jarring her bruised ribs. A laugh rippled through the group behind her. It wasn't a cruel laugh, exactly. It was the laughter of people watching a clumsy animal. Elena looked up, spitting dirt. One of the women, younger than Lyra but with the same sharp, avian eyes, prodded Elena's boot with the butt of her spear. She said something to the warrior beside her, gesturing at the heavy, synthetic soles. They were marveling at her feet, wondering perhaps if her hooves were made of black stone. Elena scrambled up before the woman could prod harder. "Don't look weak," she told herself. "Weak things get eaten." The descent was a slow agony. The adrenaline of the capture had faded, replaced by the grim reality of her physical condition. She was dehydrated, battered from the crash, and running on a calorie deficit that was quickly becoming critical. The heat of the afternoon trapped under the canopy was oppressive, a humid blanket that made the air feel like soup. She focused on her captors to keep her mind from spiraling into panic. 7 individuals, she cataloged, forcing her brain into analytical mode. Standard hunter-gatherer raiding party configuration. Karg was the alpha, aggression, size, volume. He wore the most ornamentation, a necklace of wolf teeth, armbands of woven grass and leather. Lyra, the older woman, was the intellect. She walked freely, not carrying heavy loads, her eyes constantly scanning the forest, not just for threats but for resources. Twice, Elena saw her stop to pluck a specific leaf or strip bark from a sapling, tucking them into a pouch at her waist. Shaman, healer, keeper of knowledge. And then there was the flanker, the young man from the ridge, Tor. He brought up the rear, moving with a quiet efficiency that contrasted with Karg's bombast. He was leaner, his muscles corded like wire rather than bulked like slabs. He didn't participate in the mockery. His job was security. Every time a bird called out of rhythm, Tor stopped, head tilted, listening. He was carrying her satchel. Elena's heart skipped a beat when she saw it slung over his shoulder. That bag contained the multi-tool, the water purifier, and the shattered remnants of the Chrono's gauntlet. If they decided to smash it, or worse, try to use the vibro knife. The group came to a halt in a small clearing. where a spring bubbled up from the roots of a massive ironwood tree. Karg dropped the tether, leaving Alina standing awkwardly in the center of the clearing, while the others rushed to the water. They drank from cupped hands or used small hollowed gourds tied to their belts. Alina stood trembling, her tongue feeling like a piece of felt in her mouth. She watched the water run through Karg's beard as he drank deep, splashing his face. She took a tentative step toward the spring. Karg spun around, water dripping from his chin. He barked a sharp sound, "Grack," and leveled a finger at her, "Stay." He wasn't going to let her drink. Panic flared, dehydration killed faster than hunger. In this heat, she had hours, maybe a day, before heatstroke set in. "Water," she croaked, miming a cupped hand to her mouth. "Please." Karg ignored her, turning back to speak with the younger woman. They were laughing again, sharing a strip of dried meat. Alina looked around the circle. Lyra was busy inspecting a patch of moss. The others were resting. She looked at Tor. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, checking the fletching on a spear. He looked up and caught her gaze. Alina didn't beg, she didn't have the energy for it. She just looked at him, letting her exhaustion and need show plainly on her face. She looked at the water, then back at him. Tor paused. He looked at Karg, who was distracted. Slowly, deliberately, Tor unslung a water skin made from a darker, cured bladder. He walked over to her. He didn't hand it to her, her hands were bound, and he wasn't stupid enough to untie a prisoner. Instead, he gripped the neck of the skin and held it up. He said a word, low and guttural. "Irk." Alina opened her mouth. Tor tilted the skin. The water was tepid and tasted strongly of the animal hide it was stored in, but to Alina, it was ambrosia. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking the collar of her flight suit. "Enough," Tor grunted, or the Mesolithic equivalent, and pulled the skin away. "Thank you," Alina whispered. Tor stared at her for a moment, his dark eyes unreadable. He reached out and touched the collar of her suit, where the water had darkened the blue fabric to black. He rubbed the synthetic material between his thumb and forefinger, frowning at the texture. It wasn't skin. It wasn't plant fiber. "Shar," he murmured. "It's called nylon," Alina said, a hysterical giggle bubbling in her chest. "Polyamide." Tor pulled his hand back as if burned. He capped the water skin and walked away just as Karg turned around. The giant strode over, rechecking the knot on Alina's wrists with a rough yank. He shouted at the group, and they scrambled to their feet. Break time was over. The march resumed, but the dynamic had shifted, if only slightly. Alina was no longer just a thing to be dragged, she was a thing that needed water. She was biological. As the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, the terrain leveled out. The oppressive closeness of the forest gave way to a wider valley floor. The ground here was beaten into a path, a trail worn smooth by generations of bare feet. The smell hit her first. It drifted on the evening breeze, distinct from the loam and pine of the forest. It was a complex scent: wood smoke, searing fat, the copper tang of butchery, and the pungent, ammonia-rich smell of curring urine. It was the smell of civilization, or at least humanity. They rounded a bend in the river, the water turning gold in the fading light. Karg let out a shout, a deep, resonating call that echoed off the valley walls. From the distance, a chorus of voices answered. Dogs began to bark. Karg pulled the tether tight, forcing Alina to stumble up beside him. He wanted her visible. He wanted his prize on display. "Look," his posture seemed to say to the trees, to the river, to her. "Look what I have found." Alina lifted her head. Despite the pain, despite the terror, the archaeologist in her forced her eyes open. Ahead, smoke rose in thin gray columns against the darkening sky. The structures of the kraal emerged from the twilight, domed shapes, organic and hulking. She was walking into the past. She was walking into the history book she had studied since she was a child. I wanted to see it, she thought, a bitter irony twisting her gut as the first figures appeared on the path ahead, children running, warriors brandishing weapons. I wanted to see history unfiltered. The drums began to beat, syncing with the frantic rhythm of her heart. "Be careful what you wish for, Elena." Karg yanked the rope one last time. "Crawl," he grunted, pointing his spear at the village. Elena Voss took a breath of the smoky air and stepped into the Stone Age. Chapter 5: The Crawl. The march down the mountain was a descent into sensory violence. Elena's wrists bled where the rough vines bit into her skin. Her shins were bruised from stumbling over roots. She couldn't see through the tears stinging her eyes. But pain was a distant signal, drowned out by the overwhelming immediacy of the world she was being dragged into. As they crossed the tree line and entered the valley floor, the air changed. The crisp, pine-scented purity of the high altitude gave way to a dense, biological smog. It hit Elena like a physical wall, the metallic tang of butchered meat, the acrid, eye-watering bite of urine used for tanning hides, wood smoke that clung to the back of the throat, and the musk of unwashed human bodies living in close quarters. They rounded a bend in the river, and the village, the kraal, sprawled before them. It was a chaotic, magnificent mess of survival. There were no straight lines here. 30 or so structures huddled together, their frames constructed from the curved, bleached ribs of mammoths and the sturdy trunks of ironwood trees. They were draped in layers of heavy hides, bison, elk, and bear, stitched together with gut. Dogs, massive and wolf-like with thick ruffs of fur, erupted from the shadows, barking and snapping at the return of the hunting party. Elena shrank back as a gray beast lunged at her leg, but Karg, the scarred giant leading her tether, kicked it away with a casual brutality that made Elena flinch. "Karg, Karg." The cry went up from the perimeter. Children, naked save for mud and small amulets of bone, came running. They stopped dead when they saw Elena. Their eyes, wide and dark, tracked her strange, synthetic blue flight suit, the way it shimmered in the sun unlike any fur or leaf. Karg didn't stop. He marched her straight to the center of the settlement. Here, a massive fire pit smoldered, the ash heap rising 3 feet high, evidence of a fire that had been burning for generations. He yanked the tether, forcing Elena to her knees in the dirt. "Stay," he growled in his tongue, the meaning clear enough. The tribe gathered. Men emerged from the tanning racks, their arms stained to the elbows in red ochre and gore. Women looked up from grinding stones, their faces hard, etched with the lines of a life where winter meant death. There were about 50 of them. Elena, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, tried to count. Demographics, she forced herself to think, keep the scientist alive, low elderly population. High child mortality evident in the lack of toddlers. A surplus of women, likely men lost to hunts or raids. Karg stood over her, addressing the crowd. He gestured to the sky, then to the mountain ridge, and finally to Elena. His voice boomed, theatrical and aggressive. He was telling a story, the story of her capture. A murmur went through the crowd. A woman spat in Elena's direction. Another, holding an infant, clutched a talisman at her throat. Fear, they were terrified of her. Then Lyra, the older woman with the feather-braided hair, stepped into the circle. The crowd parted for her. She didn't carry a spear, but her authority was absolute. She walked up to Elena, her movements bird-like and sharp. Lyra reached out. Elena flinched, expecting a blow, but Lyra's hand, calloused, dirt-stained, only touched the fabric of the flight suit. She rubbed the synthetic polymer between her thumb and forefinger. She frowned, confused by the texture. Then she touched Elena's face. She traced the line of her jaw, her clean, unscarred skin. She pulled Elena's eyelid down, checking the white, then grabbed her jaw to inspect her teeth. It was an inspection of livestock. Lyra turned to Karg and spoke. Her tone was dismissive. She pointed at Elena's hands, soft, unworked hands. She mimed breaking a stick, shaking her head, weak. Karg argued. He pointed at the sky again, his voice rising, spirit. Lyra laughed, a dry, cackling sound. She grabbed Elena's bound wrists and held them up to the crowd, shouting something that made the warriors chuckle. Elena felt the heat of humiliation flush her cheeks. She didn't need a translator. Lyra was saying she was useless, not a demon, just a burden. Karg, seemingly deflated by Lyra's assessment but unwilling to lose face, cut the argument short. He barked an order to a young man standing at the edge of the circle, the one who had been watching Alina with intense, quiet eyes. Tor stepped forward. He was leaner than Karg, his build wiry and efficient, built for endurance rather than brute force. He had high cheekbones and a mop of dark hair held back by a leather thong. Karg threw the tether to Tor. "Take her," Karg's gesture said. "Cage her." Tor caught the rope. He didn't jeer like the others. He looked at Alina with a blank, unreadable expression, then tugged gently on the line. Alina scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking. As she was led away from the fire, she caught Lyra watching her. The shaman's eyes weren't hostile anymore. They were calculating. Alina realized then that being a demon would have been safer. Demons were feared. Demons were respected. Useless things were discarded. Chapter 6, The Cave. The hut they shoved her into was small, smelling of damp earth and old fur. It was less a house and more of a storage shed, located on the periphery of the village near the midden heaps. Tor tied the end of her vine tether to a heavy center pole made of petrified wood. He checked the knot twice, then backed out of the low entrance, dropping a heavy hide flap to seal her in darkness. Alina sat in the gloom, listening to his footsteps recede. The panic she had been holding back finally broke the dam. It started in her chest, a tightening that made it impossible to draw a full breath. Then the trembling started. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. "I am Dr. Alina Voss," she whispered into the dark, her voice cracking. "I am a temporal physicist. I am not here. This is a simulation. Wake up, wake up." But the smell of the hut, the musk of animal pelts, the faint scent of drying herbs was too real. The pain in her wrists was too sharp. She cried until she was hollowed out. She cried for Marcus, whom she hated. She cried for her lab assistant, Davy, whom she barely knew. She cried for the coffee shop on 4th Street and the feeling of hot water coming out of a tap. Hours passed. The sliver of light under the hide flap turned from gold to purple, then to black. The flap lifted. Alina scrambled back against the far wall, her eyes adjusting to the sudden torchlight. It was Tor. He ducked inside, bringing with him the smell of roasting meat and the chill of the night air. He stuck the torch into a sconce on the mud wall. In one hand, he held a wooden bowl, in the other, a water skin. He knelt, placing the items on the dirt floor, pushing them just within her reach. Alina stared at the food. It was a chunk of meat, gray and glistening with fat, resting on a bed of mashed tubers. Her stomach roared, a primal sound that embarrassed her. She crawled forward, ignoring the way the vines tugged at her wrists. She grabbed the water skin first, uncorking it with clumsy fingers. She drank greedily. The water tasted of leather and river silt, but it soothed her parched throat. Tor watched her. He didn't move. He sat cross-legged near the entrance, a flint knife in his hand. He wasn't threatening her. He was whittling a piece of wood, shaving off long, thin curls. Alina lowered the water skin, wiping her mouth. She looked at him. In the flickering torchlight, he looked younger than she had first thought, maybe early 20s. His face was devoid of the cruelty she saw in Karg. "Thank you," she said softly. Tor looked up, he tapped his chest. "Tor." Alina blinked. "Tor," she repeated. The syllable felt rough on her tongue. He pointed at her with the knife. "Alina," she said. "Elna," he mimicked, truncating the vowel. He nodded once, as if filing the data away, then went back to his whittling. Alina picked up the meat. It was tough, stringy venison, cooked rare. She forced herself to eat it, her scientist brain tallying the proteins and fats, survival first, despair later. As she ate, she watched him. He was her jailer, yes, but he was also the only person who had spoken a name to her. "What happens now, Tor?" she asked, knowing he couldn't understand. "Do I stay here forever? Do you sell me? Eat me?" Tor glanced up at the tone of her voice. He stopped whittling. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. He tossed it to her. Elena caught it. It was a berry, dark blue, wrinkled, a dried huckleberry. She looked at him, surprised. He mimed eating, a faint, almost imperceptible softening of his eyes. It was a kindness, a small, unnecessary kindness in a brutal world. Elena popped the berry into her mouth. Sweetness exploded on her tongue, a taste of the summer that had passed. "Thank you," she said again. Tor didn't respond. He stood up, took the torch, and left her in the darkness. But this time, the darkness felt a little less suffocating. Chapter 7: Phonemes. Language was a wall. Elena had to dismantle it, brick by brick, using only her fingers and her patience. For the next week, her world was the hut and the 10-foot radius allowed by her tether when Tor let her outside for fresh air and sanitation. The tribe ignored her, treating her like a leashed dog that had ceased to be interesting. Tor was her constant. He sat guard duty for hours, usually working on weapons or tools. Elena began the work. She pointed at the ground, dirt, soil. Tor looked at her, bored. She tapped the ground relentlessly. Dirt. "Grum," Tor grunted finally, not looking up. "Grum," Elena repeated. She pointed at the sky. Sky. Tor sighed, putting down his spear. "Voon." "Evoon." It was exhausting. Elena's throat ached from the guttural sounds, the glottal stops that didn't exist in English or German. She mentally catalogued every word, trying to find a linguistic root. Was it Proto-Indo-European? No. The syntax was agglutinative, piling suffixes onto root words. It sounded vaguely like localized Basque or perhaps a language entirely lost to history, an evolutionary dead end. There were misunderstandings, dangerous ones. On the fourth day, Elena tried to ask for a bath. She felt filthy, her skin crawling with grime. She mimed washing her arms, splashing water. Tor's eyes narrowed. He stood up, gripping his spear, looking around wildly. "No, no," Elena said, waving her hands. "Wash water." Tor shouted for Karg. Elena froze. What did I say? Karg arrived, looking angry. Tor spoke rapidly, gesturing to the river and then making a slashing motion across his throat. Drowning, they thought she was asking to drown herself, or perhaps asking to drown them. Karg stomped over, grabbed her face in his massive hand, and shouted, "Na eska, na. No demon, no." He shoved her back. Elena sat in the dirt, heart racing. "I just wanted to wash," she whispered, tears of frustration pricking her eyes. Tor looked at her, seeing the tears. He seemed confused. He crouched down, mimicking her splashing motion, then pointed to the river with a questioning tilt of his head. "Urk," he said, "water." "Urk," Elena nodded, then she rubbed her skin. "Clean." Tor paused. He looked at his own arm, grimy with soot, then he looked at hers. Understanding dawned. "Ah, so, wash/clean." He looked at Karg, who was still fuming. Tor spoke calmly, explaining. Karg rolled his eyes, muttered something that sounded like useless soft skin, and stalked off. Tor turned back to Elena. He didn't smile, but the tension left his shoulders. "Sul," he repeated. "Sul," Elena said. That afternoon, he brought her a wooden bucket of water and a rough sponge made of dried gourd. He stood with his back turned while she stripped off her flight suit and scrubbed the week's dirt from her body. It was freezing cold water, and the sponge scratched her raw, but it was the most human she had felt since the crash. As she pulled the suit back on, shivering, she sat beside Tor. She picked up a stick and drew a circle in the dirt. "Son," she said. "Aru," Tor said. "Aru," Elena repeated. She drew a stick figure. She pointed to herself. "Elena." Tor pointed to the figure. "Elna." She drew a second figure holding a spear. She pointed to him. "Tor." They spent the next hour trading words: og fire, gur a hunt, Maddie tree. It wasn't a conversation. It was data entry. But as the sun went down, casting long shadows across the crawl, Elena felt the wall becoming a little less formidable. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a student, and Tor, the silent warrior, was a surprisingly patient teacher. Chapter 8, The Test of Utility. The crisis arrived with the new moon. The hunting parties had returned empty-handed for 3 days straight. The herds were moving erratically, spooked by wolves or weather. The mood in the kraal turned brittle. Arguments broke out over the rationing of dried meat. Elina heard the shouting from inside her hut. She peeked through the flap. Karg stood by the central fire, arguing with Lyra and a group of elders. He was gesturing violently toward Elina's hut. Elina caught fragments of words she had learned: meat, mouth, useless, winter coming. A cold dread pooled in her stomach. They were discussing the economics of survival. She was a mouth that ate but did not contribute. In the equation of the Paleolithic, she was a variable that needed to be eliminated. Lyra was arguing back, but her voice was wavering. She pointed to the sky, invoking the spirits, but spirits didn't fill bellies. Karg marched toward the hut. Tor tried to intercept him, stepping in his path, but Karg shoved him aside effortlessly. Karg ripped the hide flap open. He grabbed Elina by the arm and dragged her out into the harsh midday light. He threw her to the ground in front of the elders. He threw a spear at her feet. "Gura," he shouted, "hunt." Elina stared at the heavy wooden weapon. She picked it up. It was unbalanced in her hands, heavy and awkward. She had never thrown a spear in her life. Karg laughed, a cruel, barking sound. He gestured to a target dummy set up for the children, a bundle of hay 30 feet away. "Gara," he commanded. Elina stood up. She knew physics. She knew trajectories. But knowing the equation for a parabola didn't give her the muscle memory of a hunter. She wound up and threw. The spear wobbled in the air, flew 10 feet, and clattered uselessly into the dirt, nowhere near the target. The tribe erupted in jeers. Karg drew his stone knife. He looked at the elders. "See? Useless." Tor stepped forward again, his face pale. "Wait," he said in his tongue. But Karg ignored him. He advanced on Elina. This wasn't an execution, it was a culling. Elina scrambled back. Her mind raced. She couldn't hunt, she couldn't fight. What could she do? Her eyes darted around the circle. She saw a woman sitting by a hut, struggling with a pile of sinew and bark fibers. She was trying to weave a carrying net, but the knots were slipping, the mesh uneven. Structure, tension, geometry. Elina dropped the spear. She ran past Karg, surprising him, and knelt by the woman. "Stop," Karg roared, raising the knife. Elina ignored him. She grabbed the fibers from the startled woman's hands. Her fingers, trembling but nimble, began to work. She didn't weave the chaotic, simple knot the woman had been using. She employed a sheet bend knot, securing the 2 different thicknesses of fiber. Then she began to weave a mesh pattern she had learned from a maritime history elective, a diamond mesh, self-tightening, incredibly strong. Her hands flew, over-under loop pull, over-under loop pull. The tribe fell silent. They watched the strange, rhythmic motion of her pale fingers. In 2 minutes, she had produced a square foot of flawless, uniform netting. She grabbed a heavy stone and placed it in the center, then pulled the corners. The mesh tightened perfectly, holding the weight without slipping. She stood up and held the net out to Karg. She didn't look at him with fear anymore. She looked at him with defiance. "Work," she said, using the word she had learned yesterday, crow. Karg stopped. He looked at the net. He looked at the perfect symmetry of the knots. He snatched it from her hand and tugged at it. He pulled with all his strength. The knots held. He looked at Lyra. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes gleaming. She took the net and inspected it. She looked at Elina with a newfound respect. It wasn't the respect for a spirit. It was the respect for a craftsman. "Crow," Lyra repeated. She handed the net back to the woman, then pointed at Elina. "She stays, she works." Karg lowered the knife. He spat on the ground, signaling the end of the matter. If she works, she eats. If she stops, she dies. He turned and walked away. Elina let out a breath, her knees buckling. Tor was there instantly, catching her arm to steady her. "Sheet bend," she whispered to him, hysterical laughter bubbling in her chest. "It's called a sheet bend." Tor didn't understand the words, but he nodded. He looked at her hands, the hands that couldn't hold a spear but could weave a prison for a stone. He untied the tether from her waist. Elena looked up at him. "Free?" she asked. Tor shook his head. He pointed to the pile of raw fiber the women were gathering. "Crow," he said sternly. Elena nodded. She sat down in the dirt, surrounded by the women of the tribe. They watched her wary, but one of them slid a bundle of sinew toward her. Elena picked it up. She began to weave. She was still a captive, still lost in time, but she had bought herself another day. And in this world, a day was a lifetime. Chapter 9, The Sickness. The enemy didn't come with spears or fangs. It came in the silence of the night, invisible and relentless. It had been 3 weeks since Elena had woven the net, earning her precarious place in the workforce of the kraal. She spent her days with the women, her hands raw from stripping bark and scraping hides, her mind numbed by the repetition. But she was observant. She was a scientist in a living laboratory, and she noticed the change in the baseline data before anyone else. It started with the children. At first, it was just lethargy. The usual shrieking games of chase the wolf died down. Toddlers clung to their mothers' legs, their eyes glassy. Then came the fever, hot and dry, followed by the purging. By the 3rd day, the smell of the village changed. The wood smoke and roasting meat were overpowered by the sharp, copperandrot stench of dysentery. Elena sat in her hut. She was still tethered at night, though the rope was longer now, and listened to the sounds of the kraal. It was a chorus of misery. Mothers wailing soft, rhythmic prayers, men pacing, the retching of the sick. Karg's own son, a boy of 6 named Jayruk, was struck down. The giant chieftain stormed through the village, shouting at the sky, threatening the spirits. He sacrificed a deer at the central fire, burning the choice cuts, begging the ancestors to eat the sickness. But biology didn't care about burnt offerings. Elena watched from the entrance of her hut as Lyra moved from shelter to shelter. The shaman looked exhausted. She carried a bowl of paste, crushed herbs and mud marking the foreheads of the sick. It was a spiritual quarantine, a desperate attempt to ward off the bad air. Elena knew it wasn't the air, it was the water. The village drew its water from the river bend, a convenient spot where the current slowed. But just 50 yards upstream, the hunters cleaned their kills. 100 yards above that, a tributary fed in from the ridge where the tribe relieved themselves. It was a textbook fecal-oral transmission vector, Giardia or Cryptosporidium, perhaps bacterial dysentery. In 2147, a nanopill would fix it in an hour. Here, it was a mass extinction event in slow motion. Tor arrived at her hut with her evening ration, a meager tuber. He looked haggard. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Jayruk falls," Tor said, his voice heavy. He made a motion with his hand, a fluttering bird falling to earth. "Many fall." Elena stood up. She couldn't sit and watch them die of ignorance. "Tor," she said, using the vocabulary she had painstakingly built. "Not spirits, not air." She pointed to the water skin at his belt. She said, water, bad water, sickness in water." Tor frowned. He uncorked the skin and smelled it. "Water good, river spirit gives." "River spirit is angry," Elena improvised, desperate to bridge the conceptual gap. "River spirit puts tiny beasts in water, too small to see, they eat the belly." Tor stared at her. The concept of microscopic life was as alien to him as quantum mechanics. He shook his head. "Lyra says ancestors are angry. We did not give enough fat to the fire." "No," Elena grabbed his arm. It was a forbidden touch, but she didn't care. "Look at me. I heal your leg. Yes." Tor looked at the faint scar on his calf, where she had packed the moss. He nodded slowly. "I know this," she insisted, tapping her temple. "I can fix. Let me show." Tor hesitated. He looked toward the chieftain's hut, where the sound of a child's weak crying drifted on the wind. He looked back at the strange woman from the stars with her intense, pale eyes. "If you lie," Tor whispered, "Karg will kill you." "If I lie," Elena said, "let him." Chapter 10, The Filter. The confrontation at the riverbank was tense. Tor had dragged Elena there, interrupting Lyra, who was filling a gourd for the chieftain's sick son. When Tor explained what Elena claimed, that the water was poison, Lyra had hissed like a cornered cat. To question the water was to question the lifeblood of the valley. "She speaks madness," Lyra shouted, clutching her staff. "She wants to dry our throats." A small crowd gathered. Karg pushed through them, his face a mask of grief and rage. He looked ready to snap Elena in half. "Show," Karg growled. It wasn't a request, it was a challenge. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She needed materials. She scanned the riverbank. "I need sand," she said, pointing to the fine silt at the water's edge. "Gravel," she pointed to the rocky shallows, "and charcoal from the fire, black wood." The villagers murmured. This was garbage. She was asking for trash. "Get it," Karg barked at Tor. While Tor ran to the fire pit, Elena found a large piece of birch bark. She rolled it into a tight cone, tying it with grass, leaving a small hole at the bottom. She placed the cone over an empty gourd. When Tor returned with a handful of cooling embers, Elena crushed them between two stones. Her hands turned black with soot. "Watch," she commanded. She layered the materials inside the bark cone. First the moss she had pulled from a tree to hold the layers, then the charcoal for adsorption of toxins and bacteria, then the sand, fine filtration, then the gravel, coarse filtration. It looked like a mud pie. Lyra sneered, "Dirt eating dirt." Elena took Lyra's gourd, the one filled with river water. It was murky, swirling with sediment. "Bad water," Elena said. She poured the water into the top of her contraption. The tribe held its breath. For a long moment, nothing happened. The water soaked into the charcoal and sand. Then, a frantic drip, drip, drip began at the bottom of the cone. The water that fell into the empty gourd below was not brown. It was clear, crystal clear. A gasp went through the crowd. Elena waited until the gourd was half full. She picked it up. She looked at Karg. "Spirits gone," she said. "Bad beasts gone." She raised the gourd to her own lips. This was the gamble. If she was wrong, if it was a virus that passed through charcoal, or if she hadn't used enough, she would get sick too. But she had to prove it. As she drank, she wiped her mouth and handed the gourd to Karg. The giant looked at the clear water. He looked at the river, then at the black sludge in the cone. It was magic. It was turning earth into purity. He knelt and held the gourd to his dying son's lips. The boy drank, weakly at first, then more eager. "Make more," Karg whispered, looking up at Elena. The rage was gone from his eyes, replaced by a terrifying awe. "Make for all." Elena spent the next 2 days running a filtration factory. She supervised the construction of 3 large tripod filters using hollowed-out logs. She taught the women how to layer the charcoal, how to change the sand when it clogged. She implemented new laws. "No waste in river," she ordered, drawing a line in the dirt. "Waste goes there, in hole, far from water." They grumbled about digging latrines, but they obeyed, because the sickness stopped. The fever broke in J-Rock. The lethargy lifted from the village. The smell of rot faded, replaced once again by the smell of wood smoke and life. Lyra watched it all. She didn't bow to Elena. She didn't apologize. But one evening, she came to Elena's hut and placed a necklace of dried berries and owl feathers on the ground. It was a shaman's token. "You see small beasts," Lyra said, her voice unreadable. "You have eyes that pierce the water." "No eyes," Elena said, touching her head. "Knowledge." Lyra tapped Elena's chest. "Spirit." She turned and left. Elena picked up the necklace. It felt heavy. She wasn't just the net weaver anymore. She was the water walker, the purifier. She was becoming essential, and that was a dangerous thing to be. Chapter 11, The Hunter's Wound. Integration brought freedom, but it also brought proximity to violence. It was late autumn when the hunting party returned in disarray. There were no shouts of victory, no blowing of the triumph horn. There was only the sound of men struggling under a heavy weight and the sharp scent of fresh blood. Elena was by the drying racks, scraping a deer hide with a flint tool. Her hands had hardened, calluses shielded her palms, and her fingernails were short and jagged. She looked up as the group stumbled into the kraal. They were carrying Tor. Elena dropped the scraper and ran. She didn't ask for permission. She pushed through the crowd gathering around the fallen hunter. Tor was conscious but pale, his skin clammy and gray. His left thigh was a ruin. A wild boar, the tusk beast, had gored him. The tusk had ripped through the leather leggings, tearing a jagged furrow through the quadriceps muscle, missing the femoral artery by mere millimeters. The wound was gaping, the muscle exposed, bleeding sluggishly but persistently. Dirt and forest debris were ground into the meat. Lyra was already there, chanting, shaking a rattle of bones over the wound. She reached for a handful of mud to pack into the cut to stop the bleeding. "No," Elena shouted, grabbing Lyra's wrist. The crowd gasped. To touch the healer during a rite was taboo. "Mud makes rot," Elena cried. She looked at Karg, who stood over them looking helpless. "Karg, no mud, I fix." Karg looked at Lyra, then at Tor's ashen face. He remembered the water. "Let her," Karg grunted. Lyra hissed, but pulled her hand back. Elena went into crisis mode. "Hot water," she ordered. "Boiled now and the bone needle, the thin one." She had her satchel nearby. Tor had returned it to her weeks ago. She pulled out the remnants of her med kit. The antiseptic spray was empty. The biofoam was gone. She had only a small pair of metal forceps and her vibroknife. While the women rushed to fetch the water, Elena cut away the ruined legging with her knife. Tor groaned, his head thrashing back against the dirt. "Hold him," Elena commanded. 2 warriors pinned Tor's shoulders. When the water came, steaming in a gourd, Elena didn't hesitate. She flushed the wound. Tor screamed. It was a raw, animal sound that tore at Elena's heart, but she didn't stop. She used the forceps to pick out splinters of wood and clumps of dirt. She had to get it clean. Infection was the killer here. "Needle," she demanded. Lyra handed her a needle made from a fish bone, threaded with fine, sterilized sinew. Elena looked at Tor. His eyes were rolled back, glassy with shock. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "Tor," she said, using the command voice, "look at me." His eyes fluttered, focusing on hers. "Pain comes," she said, "do not move." He gritted his teeth, nodding once. Elena began to sew. It was brutal work. The fish bone wasn't as sharp as surgical steel. She had to push hard to pierce the tough skin, pulling the jagged edges of the wound together. Every puncture made Tor's body spasm, his muscles turning to rock under the warrior's hands. Elena stitched the muscle fascia first, then the skin suture. Not cut, suture, not cut. She worked with a mechanic's precision, blocking out the whimpers of the man she cared for. When the last knot was tied, she smeared the wound with honey, one of the few natural antiseptics she knew they had, and bound it tightly with boiled strips of linen. She sat back, her hands covered in his blood. She was shaking. Tor lay still. He was breathing heavily, sweat soaking his hair. He reached out a hand. His fingers brushed her knee. "Elna," he whispered. Elena took his hand. It was hot, trembling. "Sleep now," she said softly. "You keep the leg." Karg stepped forward. He looked at the stitched wound, a neat, black line of sinew holding the flesh together. It was unlike the jagged scars most warriors bore. "Iron fingers," Karg muttered. He looked at Elena with a strange expression. It wasn't just awe anymore, it was acceptance. "You fight death for him." "He is," Elena searched for the word friend, "guard, he is mine to guard." Karg nodded, "Then guard him well." For the next 3 nights, Elena didn't leave Tor's side. She slept sitting up in his hut, waking every hour to check for fever, to force water down his throat. On the second night, the fever spiked. Tor thrashed in delirium, calling out names of the dead. Elena bathed his forehead with cool water, singing soft lullabies in German, songs from a world that wouldn't exist for 12,000 years. Gutnabend, gut-nacked, mit Rosen bedackt. Tor settled at the sound of her voice. In his fever, he grabbed her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his beating heart. "Stay," he mumbled. "I'm here," Elena whispered, stroking his hair. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time since the crash, she meant it. The thought of the Chronos device, hidden in the thatch of her hut, felt distant. The timeline could wait. This life, this singular, fragile life beating under her hand, was the only variable that mattered. Chapter 12, A Seat at the Fire. Winter was coming. The wind that swept down from the glacier had teeth, biting through the thin walls of the huts. Tor recovered. He walked with a limp, using a spear as a cane, but the leg held. He was alive. 2 weeks after the injury, a ceremony was held. It was the feast of the first frost. Elena was in her hut, mending the net, when Lyra entered. The shaman carried a bundle in her arms. Lyra didn't speak. She unfolded the bundle on the floor. It was a set of clothes, not the rough, discarded scraps Elena had been wearing over her deteriorating flight suit. This was a tunic of soft, cured doe skin, bleached white, and trimmed with beaver fur. There were leggings, thick boots lined with wool, and a heavy cloak of bison hide. It was high-status clothing. It was beautiful. "Your skin is thin," Lyra said, touching the worn nylon of Elena's suit. "The frost will eat you." "Lyra," Elena started, touched by the gift. "The blue skin," Lyra pointed to the flight suit. "It is dead, take it off." Elena froze. The flight suit was her last armor. It was the uniform of Dr. Elena Voss. It was the symbol of the 22nd century. To take it off felt like an amputation. "It is who I am," Elena whispered. Lyra shook her head. "It is who you were. You are river walker now. You are healer. You are crawl." Lyra left the clothes and exited the hut. Elena stared at the doeskin tunic. She ran her hands over the stitching, expert, tight, waterproof. Someone had spent weeks making this. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she unzipped the flight suit. The sound of the zipper was loud, mechanical, alien in the quiet hut. She peeled the synthetic fabric down. It smelled of old sweat and ozone. She stepped out of it. She stood naked in the cool air, her body pale, scarred, leaner than it had ever been. She was hard muscle and bone now. She pulled on the doe skin. It was warm, soft, heavy. It smelled of earth and smoke. She pulled on the boots. They molded to her feet. She bundled the flight suit up. She hesitated, then shoved it deep into the bottom of her sleeping pile next to the Chronos core. She stepped out of the hut. The wind caught her cloak, billowing it around her. Tor was waiting for her. He wore ceremonial paint, red stripes on his cheeks. He saw her in the new clothes, and his eyes widened. A slow smile spread across his face. "Crawl," he said approvingly. "Crawl," she agreed. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked to the central fire. Usually, Elena sat on the periphery, eating with the women and children. But tonight, Tor led her past the outer ring. He led her to the inner circle, close to the fire where the heat was intense. Karg sat on a pile of furs. He looked up as they approached. He nodded to a space on his left, directly across from Lyra. "Sit," Karg said. Elena sat. The firelight danced in her eyes. Someone handed her a wooden bowl filled with the best cut of meat, fatty, rich venison. Someone else poured her a cup of fermented berry juice. She looked around the circle. These faces, scarred, painted, illuminated by the flames, were no longer strangers. There was Nala, whose baby she had saved with the filter. There was Gorn, the toolmaker she had taught to weave. There was Lyra, who challenged her and respected her. And there was Tor, whose thigh pressed warmly against hers. She took a bite of the meat. It was smoky and delicious. Laughter erupted across the fire as Karg told a body story about a bear and a honey pot. Elena found herself laughing too, understanding the nuance of the joke. She looked up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, a diamond dust scattered across the velvet void. They were the same stars she had studied in the astrophysics dome in New Berlin, but they looked different here. They didn't look like coordinates or solar systems. They looked like stories. "I am Dr. Elena Voss," she thought, the words feeling faint, like a memory from a dream. Tor nudged her, offering her more juice. "Good?" he asked. Elena looked at him. She looked at the fire that kept back the dark. "Good," she said. "Home." The word slipped out before she could catch it. She waited for the panic, for the scientist in her brain to rebel. But there was only the crackle of the fire and the warmth of the man beside her. Dr. Elena Voss was gone, at least for tonight. Elna of the Kraal took another drink and joined the song. Chapter 13, Winter's Breath. The transition was not gradual. In the Neolithic, seasons did not drift, they conquered. One morning, the heavy autumnal rains turned to needles of sleet. By the next dawn, the world had been erased. The vibrant greens and muddy browns of the valley were buried under 3 feet of crushing, blinding white. The river, the lifeblood of the Kraal, froze at the edges, its roar silenced to a sullen gurgle beneath thick plates of ice. This was not the winter Elena knew from ski trips to the Alps or the climate-controlled biodomes of 2147. This was the tail end of the Pleistocene. This was a living, predatory force. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero. The air grew so sharp it felt like inhaling broken glass. Karg called the hunters to the central fire. They looked like bears standing on 2 legs, wrapped in layers of shaggy pelts, their breath pluming in the gray light. "The great walkers move," Karg announced, his voice muffled by his furs. "We must strike before the snow deepens." The mammoths primigenius, woolly mammoths. Elena stood with them. She was bundled in her doe skin, with extra layers of woven grass stuffed between the furs for insulation, a trick she had taught Tor. She carried a spear, though she knew her role wasn't to throw. She was the watcher. Her eyes, trained on high-speed data streams, caught movement others missed. They trekked for 2 days, moving toward the bottleneck of the valley where the herds migrated south. The silence of the snow-draped forest was unnerving. There were no birds, no insects, just the crunch of snowshoes, crude oval frames of bent willow and sinew that Elena had helped design, and the wind. On the 3rd day, they found them. The herd was small, 6 adults and 2 calves, moving like gray mountains through the drifts. Their tusks, curved and massive, swept the snow aside to reach the frozen grasses beneath. The plan was ancient and brutal. Separate a straggler, drive it into deep snow where its weight would become its prison. "Tor," Elena whispered, pointing to the rear of the herd. "The bull on the flank, he favors his left leg, old injury." Tor nodded, signaling Karg. The ambush was unleashed with a scream. Karg led the charge, a roar of primal aggression designed to panic the beasts. The herd trumpeted, a sound that vibrated in Elena's teeth and stampeded. The ground shook. The old bull lagged. He turned to fight, swinging his massive head. "Now," Karg bellowed. The hunters flanked him, spears flew. Elena watched from the ridge, heart hammering. It wasn't a clean kill. It was a messy, exhausting attrition. The bull fought with terrifying power, snapping spears like twigs. One hunter, Orem, was tossed aside, landing in a snowbank with a sickening thud. But the deep snow did its work. The bull floundered, sinking to his belly. The hunters closed in with heavy thrusting spears. Elena turned away when the end came. She respected the science of survival, the caloric necessity of this death, but the suffering of such a magnificent creature was hard to witness. When silence returned, the work began. Butchering a 6-ton animal in freezing temperatures was a race against time. The meat would freeze solid within hours. They worked in a frenzy, steam rising from the carcass, turning the pristine snow crimson. Elena carried slabs of meat until her shoulders screamed. She didn't complain. She saw the grim satisfaction in Karg's eyes. "We eat," he grunted, handing her a chunk of raw, warm fat. "Eat, keep the cold out." Elena ate it. It was greasy and repulsive, but her body craved the energy. They dragged the spoils back on sledges made from the mammoth's ribs. They returned to the kraal as heroes, but exhausted ones. Tor walked beside her, his limp pronounced in the deep snow. He didn't speak, but every few miles he would bump his shoulder against hers. A check-in, still here, still moving. Still moving, she whispered into her scarf. But as they crested the final ridge and looked down at the village, Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The snow was piled high against the huts. No smoke rose from 3 of the chimneys. The cold was not just an enemy outside the walls. It had breached the perimeter. Chapter 14, Starvation. The mammoth meat lasted a month. It should have lasted 3, but the winter was the wolf's tooth, unusually fierce, unrelenting. The game disappeared. The river froze solid, requiring hours of chipping with stone axes to reach water. By midwinter, the kraal was silent. Hunger is not a sharp pain, it is a dull, heavy blanket. It slows the mind. It makes sleep difficult, yet waking seems pointless. The rationing began. Karg and the hunters ate first. They had to in order to scavenge for wood and check the empty traps. Then the children, then the elders. Elena watched the inevitable calculus of the Stone Age play out. Grunta, the oldest woman in the tribe, a weaver of baskets and stories, stopped eating. She claimed her stomach hurt, that she wasn't hungry, but Elena saw her slipping her portions to her grandchildren. Elena sat with her in the dim hut. Grunta's skin was like parchment stretched over bird bones. "Eat, Grunta," Elena pleaded, holding a bowl of broth made from boiled bones and pine needles, a source of vitamin C Elena insisted on to prevent scurvy. Grunta shook her head, smiling weakly. Her teeth were loose in her gums. "The winter is long, Elna," the old woman whispered. "I have seen many snows. My season is done." "No," Elena said, frustration rising. "It's just calories, it's just energy. We can." "We can what?" Elena looked at her hands. In her mind, she had the knowledge to perform an appendectomy, to splice genes, to navigate a starship. But she couldn't conjure protein from thin air. She couldn't synthesize glucose. All her advanced degrees, all her knowledge of the quantum universe, and she was helpless against the simple thermodynamics of starvation. Grunta died 2 nights later. The ground was too frozen to dig a grave. They placed her body on a high scaffold, wrapped in furs, to keep her from the wolves until the thaw. The mood in the village broke. Despair settled in. People stopped mending their clothes. They stopped telling stories. They huddled under their furs, waiting for the end. Elena felt the pull of the lethargy. It would be so easy to just lie down next to Tor and sleep. No. The voice in her head was sharp. It sounded like Marcus, "You don't respect the variable, Elena." "Screw the variable," she hissed into the dark. She sat up, her breath fogged in the freezing air of the hut. It was barely warmer inside than outside. The wind whistled through the gaps in the mammoth bones, sucking the heat away as fast as their bodies produced it. Thermodynamics, she thought, entropy, heat transfer. The huts were flawed. They were designed for ventilation in summer, not insulation in this deep freeze. She shook Tor awake. "Tor," she rasped, "wake up." He groaned, his eyes sunken. "What, is it morning?" "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "It's time to work. If we stay like this, we die. We need to change the hut." Tor looked at her as if she were mad. "Change? The hut is the hut. Ancestors built them so." "The ancestors are dead," Elena snapped. "And Grunta is dead. We are alive. Get up." Chapter 15, The Innovation. The resistance was immediate. When Elena started packing snow against the outer walls of her hut, mixing it with ash and water to create a slush that would freeze into a solid windbreak, the remaining elders muttered. "She buries herself," one said. "She builds a tomb." But Elena ignored them. She worked with a manic energy fueled by the last of her reserves. She explained the concept to Tor as they worked. "The snow holds air," she said, packing a brick of snow against the leather wall. Air stops the cold. Like fur, fur holds air, snow holds air. Tor didn't understand the physics of thermal conductivity, but he understood fur. He began to help her. They built a wall of snow bricks 3 feet thick around the perimeter of their hut, leaving only a narrow tunnel for the entrance, an airlock to prevent wind gusts from blowing directly in. Inside, Alina reorganized. She lowered the sleeping platform to the floor. Heat rises, but in these drafty huts, the wind cut through the gaps higher up. By sealing the base and creating a cold sink near the door, she trapped the radiant heat from their bodies and the small oil lamp. By nightfall, the difference was palpable. The howling wind was muffled to a dull roar. The air inside the hut grew still. The temperature rose, not to tropical levels, but enough that they could take off their heavy outer parkas without shivering. Karg came to inspect it the next morning. He crawled through the tunnel, skepticism etched on his face. He stood up inside, he stopped, he pulled off his glove, he felt the air. It was 10 degrees warmer than the outside. He looked at Alina. She was sitting by the small fire, exhausted but triumphant. "It is quiet," Karg said. "Warm," Alina corrected. "Energy saved." Karg nodded slowly. He didn't praise her. He simply turned to Tor. "Show the others, now." The innovation didn't stop at insulation. The starvation was partly due to spoilage. The meat they had harvested in autumn had rotted in the dampness of the thaw cycles before the deep freeze. Alina introduced the concept of the smokehouse. She took the remaining scraps of meat, sinewy, tough bits that were usually discarded, and built a small, enclosed rack over a smudge fire of green pine. "Smoke kills the rot," she explained to Lyra. "It dries the meat, makes it hard but keeps it good." Lyra tasted a piece of the smoked jerky. It was tough as leather, but it had no taint of decay. "You change the world, Elna," Lyra whispered, watching the smoke curl around the rack. "You do not let it be." "The world tries to kill us," Alina said grimly. "I fight back." The tribe survived. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed ghosts, but they survived. The snow-insulated huts saved calories. The smoked jerky filled the gaps between scarce kills. Alina Voss had not just observed history, she had nudged it. Chapter 16, Ember and Ash. The blizzard that hit in late winter was the final scream of the season. It buried the huts completely. For 3 days, no one could leave. Alina and Tor were trapped in their snow-encased shelter. The space was small, lit only by the golden glow of a seal fat lamp. The air was thick with the scent of their bodies and the burning oil. They lay on the furs, huddled together for warmth. The intimacy of the past months, the shared work, the shared danger, had been building to this enforced proximity. Tor was whittling a piece of bone, his movements slow and deliberate. Alina was watching the flame, her mind drifting. "Tell me," Tor said softly, breaking the silence. "Tell you what?" "The stars," he said. "The place you come from, you say you are not spirit, but you know things no woman knows." Alina looked at him. In the dim light, the angles of his face were softened. The scar on his leg, the one she had sewn, was a white line against his skin. "It is a place of wonders, Tor," she admitted, her voice low. "We have huts that touch the sky. We have light that never burns out. We travel faster than the hawk." Tor stopped whittling. "And the people, are they happy?" Alina paused. She thought of Marcus. She thought of the lonely nights in her apartment, the silence of a life dedicated to equations. She thought of the Temporal Integrity Commission, the wars over resources, the sterile beauty of New Berlin. "They are safe," she said. "They are full, but happy. I don't know, they are lonely." Tor turned to her. He placed the bone tool on the ground. He reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "You are not lonely here," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No," Alina whispered, her breath hitched. "I am not." He leaned in. The distance between them vanished. It wasn't a desperate collision like in the movies. It was a slow, inevitable gravitation. His lips tasted of smoke and winter. When he kissed her, Elena didn't think about the timeline. She didn't think about the grandfather paradox or the contamination of the gene pool. She thought about the heat of his skin. She thought about the strength in his arms as he pulled her closer, the weight of his body grounding her in the present moment. They shed the layers of fur. Skin met skin in the warm, quiet dark of the hut. It was an act of life in the midst of a world of death. It was primal and tender and terrifyingly real. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the storm raging impotently above their heads. Tor traced the line of her spine with his finger. "You stay," he whispered into her hair. "When the snow melts, you do not go back to the sky huts." Elena closed her eyes. The image of the Chronos core, hidden beneath the very furs they lay on, burned in her mind. It was broken, but perhaps repairable. The signal could be sent. But as she felt Tor's heartbeat against her back, steady and strong, the equation changed. The future was a cold, bright place. The past, this past, was hard, it was brutal. But it was warm. "I stay," Elena lied. Or perhaps she told the truth. She didn't know yet. Tor kissed her shoulder, satisfied. He fell asleep, his breathing deep and even. Elena lay awake, listening to the wind howl. She stared at the roof of the hut. "I am not just observing anymore," she thought. "I am living." But deep down, the scientist in her knew that variables eventually had to be resolved. The signal beacon was still there, and sooner or later, the snow would melt. Chapter 17, The Rock Fangs. The thaw arrived not with a whisper, but with a roar. The ice on the river cracked, sending massive white plates crashing downstream like colliding tectonic plates. Mud replaced the snow, deep, sucking mud that coated everything in a layer of brown primal slime. But with the mud came life. Green shoots pierced the thawing earth. Migratory birds returned, their calls filling the silence that had haunted the valley for months. Elena stood on the ridge overlooking the crawl, breathing in the scent of wet pine and ozone. She felt lighter. The constant, crushing pressure of thermal survival had lifted. "The earth wakes," Tor said, appearing beside her. He was cleaning his spear, a new flint tip gleaming in the sun. "And so does everything else," Elena replied, scanning the horizon. Her uneasiness wasn't paranoia, it was data analysis. The herds would return, and with them, the competition. Tor stiffened. He dropped to a crouch, his eyes locking onto a patch of scrub oak near the treeline, about 100 yards away. "What is it?" Elena whispered, reaching for the knife at her belt. Tor didn't answer. He moved down the slope, silent as a shadow. Elena followed, stepping where he stepped to avoid snapping twigs. They reached the treeline. Tor pointed to a patch of mud. There was a footprint. It was wide, splayed, and deeply impressed. But it wasn't the footprint that froze Elena's blood, it was what lay next to it. A broken arrow shaft. The fletching wasn't the goose feather the crawl used. It was dyed black, likely crow or raven. And the tip wasn't flint. It was obsidian, black volcanic glass, jagged and wicked. Tor picked up the arrow. His face, usually stoic, darkened with a look of genuine hate. "Rock fangs," he spat. "Rivals?" Elena asked. "Killers," Tor corrected. "They live in the jagged hills to the east. They do not hunt the herds. They hunt the hunters." He stood up, gripping the broken shaft so hard it snapped. "They have seen the smoke," he said grimly. "They know we survived the White Death. They know we have meat." Elena looked at the footprint again. It pointed toward the village. "How many?" she asked. "One scout," Tor said, scanning the woods. "But where the wolf looks, the pack follows." They returned to the village at a run. The peace of the spring morning evaporated. As Tor showed the black arrow to Karg, the chieftain's face twisted into a snarl. He kicked the fire pit, sending sparks flying. "Gather the spears," Karg bellowed. "The rock fangs come." Elena watched the panic ripple through the tribe. Mothers grabbed their children. Men ran to the weapon stores. It was a chaotic, fear-driven response. This isn't a skirmish, Elena realized, her mind flashing to history books on tribal warfare. This is an existential threat, and they are reacting with emotion, not tactics. She grabbed Tor's arm. "We need a plan, not just anger." Tor looked at her, the fear in his eyes masked by a warrior's resolve. "There is no plan with rock fangs, Elna. They come at night. They burn, they take. We fight or we die." "No," Elena said, her voice hard. "We fight and we live, but only if we stop running around like frightened deer." Chapter 18, War Council. The council fire that night was a chaotic shouting match. Karg wanted to march east immediately to meet the enemy in the field. "We crush them before they cross the river," he roared, slamming his fist into his palm. Other elders argued for defense, hiding in the caves up the mountain, abandoning the village. "They want the huts. Let them take the huts. We save the blood." Elena sat quietly, listening. She sketched in the dirt with a stick. She drew the river, the bottleneck of the valley, the layout of the crawl. When the shouting lulled, she stood up. "Both plans fail," she said clearly. The circle turned to her. Karg glared. "You know winter, Skywoman. You do not know war." "I know strategy," Elena countered. "If you march east, you leave the women and children unguarded. Their scouts will slip past you and burn the village behind your back. If you hide in the caves, you starve. They will camp in your huts, eat your food, and wait for you to come down." Karg stepped closer, towering over her. "Then what? We asked them nicely to leave." Elena pointed to her drawing in the dirt. "Asymmetric warfare," she said. The term meant nothing to them, so she translated. "We fight like the spider, not the bear." She pointed to the narrow path leading to the village from the east. "They have to come this way. The river is high from the melt, the ford is dangerous. They will come single file." She looked at Tor. "We build traps, not for rabbits, for men." A murmur went through the crowd. Traps were for beasts. To use them on men was dishonorable, or perhaps just unheard of. "Pits," Elena continued, ruthless, "lined with sharpened stakes, covered with brush. We dig them here and here." She pointed to the choke points. "And the perimeter," she added. "We string lines with rattles, bones, stones. If they come at night, we hear them before they see us." Karg looked at the drawing. He looked at his warriors, few in number after the harsh winter. "This is the way of the coward," one of the older hunters muttered. "This is the way of the survivor," Elena snapped. "Do you want honor, or do you want your children to wake up tomorrow?" She looked at Tor. He had been silent, watching her. "She is right," Tor said, stepping to her side. "The rock fangs do not fight with honor. They come to steal. We stop them with the earth itself." Karg stared at the map in the dirt. He was a creature of brute force, but he was not stupid. He saw the logic of the choke points. "Dig the holes," Karg grunted finally. "But sharpen the spears, too. The spider bites, but the bear finishes the kill." For the next 2 days, the crawl transformed into a fortress. Elena directed the excavation. They dug thigh-deep pits along the approach path, lining the bottoms with fire-hardened wooden spikes. They camouflaged them with woven mats of grass and mud. She set up the alarm system. Tripwires made of darkened sinew, strung at ankle height, connected to piles of hollow gourds filled with pebbles. She felt a cold detachment as she worked. She was weaponizing her engineering knowledge. She was bringing the brutality of civilized warfare to the Stone Age. "I am contaminating this timeline," she thought as she sharpened a stake. "I am teaching them how to kill more efficiently." But then she looked at Myra, Lyra's niece, playing near the fire. She looked at Tor, limping as he carried rocks. Survival first, she repeated her mantra, ethics later. Chapter 19, The Raid. The attack did not come when they expected. Elena had predicted a night raid under the cover of the new moon. But the rock fangs were bold, or perhaps just desperate. They came at twilight. The sun had dipped below the western peaks, casting the valley in a bruised purple shadow. The light was tricky, playing havoc with depth perception. The first sign was not a sound, but a lack of one. The evening chorus of frogs near the river abruptly stopped. Elena was by the fire, checking the fletching on a batch of arrows. She froze. Tripwire. A loud clatter crash erupted from the eastern perimeter as a pile of gourds toppled over. "Contact," Elena screamed, the military term slipping out. East wall. The village exploded into motion, but this time it wasn't panic, it was a drill. Women to the longhouse, Karg bellowed. Archers the ridge, spears with me. From the shadows of the tree line, a war cry shattered the air. It was a high, ululating shriek that raised the hair on Elena's arms. Figures burst from the brush. They were painted black from head to toe, looking like shadows given form. There were at least 30 of them, more than the Kral's warriors. They charged the path. The first 3 raiders hit the traps. The ground gave way. There were sickening crunches, screams of surprise and agony as men fell onto the stakes. The momentum of the charge broke instantly. The raiders behind skidded to a halt, confused by the earth swallowing their kin. Now, Elena yelled to the archers on the hut roofs. Arrows rained down. They weren't the precise volleys of a medieval army, but they were effective at this range. 2 raiders fell, clutching their chests. But the rock fangs were veterans of brutality. They regrouped instantly, leaping over the pits, scrambling over their fallen comrades. They threw torches, bundles of pitch-soaked moss, onto the thatch of the outer huts. Fire bloomed, orange and angry against the twilight. "They're burning us out," Tor shouted, wielding his spear as a raider vaulted the low wall. The battle devolved into chaos. The lines blurred. It was hand-to-hand, primal and bloody. Elena found herself pushed back toward the central fire. A raider, his eyes wide and white in the soot-blackened face, lunged at her with a stone axe. She didn't try to block. She dropped to one knee, letting the swing go over her head, and thrust upward with her vibroknife. She hadn't activated the sonic blade. The battery was too low, but the monomolecular edge sliced through his hide armor like paper. He gasped and collapsed. Elena scrambled back, breathing hard. She looked for Tor. He was fighting back-to-back with Karg, a whirlwind of violence. Then a scream cut through the din, a child's scream. Elena spun around. Near the healer's hut, 3 raiders had flanked the main fight. They weren't engaging the warriors. They were grabbing loot. They hauled sacks of smoked meat. And one of them had Myra. The girl was kicking and biting, but the raider, a massive brute with a wolf pelt cowl, had her slung over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "No," Lyra shrieked, striking at him with her staff. The raider backhanded the old woman, sending her sprawling into the dirt. He laughed and turned to run back toward the river. "Tor," Elena screamed, pointing. "Myra." Tor heard her. He disengaged from his opponent, burying his spear in the man's thigh, and sprinted toward the river. Elena followed, her lungs burning. But they were too slow. The raiders reached the riverbank, where a set of log rafts waited. They threw the supplies and the girl onto the rafts and pushed off into the fast-moving current. Tor reached the water's edge, wading in chest-deep, but the current was fierce with the meltwater. The raft spun away, disappearing into the gathering dark. "Myra," Tor roared, slamming his fist into the water. Elena stopped at the bank, chest heaving. She watched the shadows vanish downstream. The raid was over. The remaining rock fangs, seeing their prize secured, sounded a retreat horn. They melted back into the woods, leaving behind 4 dead in the pits and 3 burning huts. Silence fell over the kraal, broken only by the crackle of flames and the weeping of Lyra. Elena stood by the water, the cold seeping into her boots. They had won the battle, the village still stood, but they had lost the future. Chapter 20, The Pursuit. The aftermath was a scene of grim triage. The fires were doused with river water. The wounded were dragged to the central fire. Lyra sat rocking back and forth, blood trickling from her lip, clutching a small doll made of woven grass, Myra's. Karg paced the perimeter, his body covered in blood, mostly not his own. He looked at the pits Elena had designed. They were filled with bodies. "They bleed like us," Karg growled, "but they took the child." "They took the winter stores, too," Tor added, limping up. He had taken a club blow to the shoulder and his arm hung stiffly. "Half the smoked meat is gone." "They will expect us to grieve," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. She was vibrating with adrenaline and cold rage. They will expect us to rebuild. They won't expect us to follow. Karg looked at her. Follow into the jagged hills, that is death. Leaving the girl is death, Elena said. They took her for a reason, slavery or leverage. She turned to Tor. Can you track them? Tor looked at the dark river. On water, no, but they must land. The rapids are ahead. They will put in at the Black Bend. Then we go to the Black Bend, Elena said. She walked to her hut. It was one of the few untouched by fire. She went to her sleeping pile and dug deep into the furs. She pulled out her satchel. She took out the multi-tool. She took out the vibro knife. And then she reached deeper. She pulled out a shard of the Chrono's device. It was a piece of the containment shielding, a curved, palm-sized fragment of hyperreflective alloy. It was practically indestructible and reflective enough to signal across miles. She stood up and strapped the sheath of the vibro knife to her thigh. She put on her heavy bison cloak. When she emerged, Karg and Tor were waiting. 3 other hunters stood with them, Oram, Jarl, and a fierce young woman named Sula who had lost an eye in a previous raid. You walk with the warriors, Karg asked, eyeing her gear. I walk as a warrior, Elena corrected. I know traps, I know how to break things, and I'm going to get Myra back. Karg nodded slowly. He hefted a new spear. We move light, he commanded. No sleep, we hunt. They left the kraal under the cover of the darkness that had concealed their enemies. They moved south, following the river. The terrain was brutal. Mud sucked at their boots and thorny underbrush tore at their clothes. But Elena didn't feel the fatigue. Her mind was locked on a singular objective. Recovery. As they marched, the moon rose, glinting off the shard of the future she clutched in her hand. It was a piece of a time machine, a device meant to observe history without interfering. Now, she was going to use it to change the outcome of a war. Hold, Tor whispered hours later. They froze. Ahead, on a mud bank where the river widened, lay the abandoned rafts. Tor crept forward, inspecting the ground. They landed, he signaled, heading east, into the canyons. Elena looked at the towering cliffs of the jagged hills. It was a fortress of stone, a labyrinth of shadows. They think they are safe, Elena whispered. She looked at the reflective shard in her hand. She angled it so it caught the moonlight, a cold, unnatural beam cutting through the dark. Let's prove them wrong. They stepped away from the river and into the jaws of the canyon. The hunt had begun. Chapter 21, Tactics. The canyon was a wound in the earth, a jagged scar of red stone that swallowed the moonlight. The Rockfang camp lay tucked in a natural amphitheater, protected on 3 sides by sheer cliff walls. Elena lay on her stomach on a high ridge, peering through a gap in the rocks. Below, the enemy camp was a hive of activity. Fires burned low. The stolen smoked meat was being divided. And in the center, tied to a stake like a trophy, was Myra. The girl was slumped forward, exhausted. A guard sat nearby, sharpening an axe. 25, Elena whispered, maybe 30 fighting men. Karg lay beside her, his breathing shallow. Too many for spears. If we charge, they kill the girl first. We don't charge, Elena said. She pulled the shard of the Chrono's casing from her pouch. We haunt them. She explained the plan. It was a classic psychological operation, leveraging the Rockfang's superstition against them. They feared spirits. She would give them a poltergeist. The team split up. Tor and Sula moved to the eastern rim, carrying bundles of dry brush and hollow logs. Karg and the others crept down to the valley floor, hiding in the scree. Elena stayed high. She positioned the shard. The moon was full, a spotlight hanging in the void. At her signal, a sharp owl cry, Tor lit the brush on the eastern rim. But he didn't let it blaze. He smothered it with damp moss, creating thick, billowing clouds of white smoke that poured down the cliff face like a spectral waterfall. The Rockfangs shouted, pointing at the ghost fog. Elena angled the shard. She caught the moonlight and focused the beam directly into the eyes of the guard watching Myra. The intense, concentrated light blinded him. He screamed, dropping his axe, clawing at his face. To the others, it looked like he had been struck by an invisible spirit. "Now," Elena hissed. From the smoke-filled shadows of the canyon floor, Karg roared, but he didn't charge the warriors. He charged the fires. He kicked the logs apart, scattering embers into the dry grass. Panic erupted. The rock fangs were fighting smoke, blinding light and fire. In the confusion, Elena slid down the scree slope. She moved not like a warrior, but like a shadow. She reached Myra. The girl looked up, eyes wide with terror. "SHH," Elena whispered, slicing the bonds with her vibroknife. The blade hummed, a sound that made Myra flinch. "Run to the river, do not stop." As Myra bolted, the rock-fang chieftain, a brute covered in ochre scars, spotted them. He realized the deception. "There," he bellowed, pointing at Elena. "The witch." He charged her. He was massive, swinging a club studded with obsidian. Elena had no spear. She had no shield. She stood her ground, the scientist brain calculating the trajectory of the swing. Mass times acceleration. She waited. As the club came down, she didn't block. She stepped inside the arc. She activated the sonic pulse of the vibroknife, the last dregs of the battery. She didn't stab him. She jammed the humming handle against his sternum and triggered the pulse. The sonic shockwave, designed to shatter rock samples, hit the chieftain's chest cavity. It stopped his heart for a full second. He dropped like a stone, gasping, eyes rolling back. The rock fangs froze. They saw their leader felled by a woman who touched him with a humming finger. "Go," Elena screamed to her team. "Move." They retreated under the cover of the smoke and the terrified silence of the enemy. They vanished into the labyrinth of the canyons, leaving the rock fangs with a downed leader and a ghost story that would last for generations. Chapter 22, The Aftermath. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and triumph. They moved fast, fearing pursuit, but the rock fangs did not follow. The psychological blow had been too severe. When they crested the final ridge and looked down at the kraal, the sun was rising. The mist clung to the river, turning the valley into a painting of gold and gray. A sentry blew a horn. The village poured out. Lyra ran faster than Elena thought possible. She collided with Myra, collapsing to her knees, sobbing as she checked the girl for wounds. There were none. Karg stood before his people. He was battered, his ochre paint smeared with sweat and soot, but he stood tall. He pointed at Elena. "The Witch of the West," he boomed, giving her a new title. "She walks through fire, she blinds the night, she brings the child home." The tribe didn't just cheer, they bowed. It wasn't the submission of slaves, it was the recognition of a savior. That night the feast was meager, they were still rationing, but the joy fed them. Tor sat beside Elena, his shoulder pressed against hers. He didn't speak much. He just kept touching her arm as if checking she was real. "You fought well," he said finally. "I fought dirty," Elena corrected, staring into the fire. "Dirty keeps us alive," Tor said. Later, as the fires died down, Lyra approached Elena. The shaman looked old, her energy spent on worry. She placed a hand on Elena's cheek. "You have given me my heart back," Lyra whispered. "You are blood now, no more Sky Woman, just Elna." Elena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She felt a cold weight in her stomach. She had saved them, she had integrated, she was loved. But in the chaos of the fight, the Chronos shard in her pocket had vibrated. Not from the impact, from a signal. It had picked up a carrier wave. Somewhere, across 12,000 years of silence, a door had opened. Chapter 23, The Signal. Summer hit the valley with a humid, buzzing intensity. The river slowed. The flowers bloomed in riots of yellow and purple. Life in the kraal returned to its rhythm, but Elena had a secret. Every afternoon, while the others gathered berries or napped in the heat, she climbed to the high cliffs above the village. She told Tor she was mapping the herds. She was mapping an extraction vector. She had laid out the components of the chrono's core on a flat rock. The main casing was shattered, but the quantum resonator, the heart of the machine, was intact. The problem had been the power coupling. The connectors were fused. But Elias Thorne was an engineer. She found a vein of native copper in the canyon walls. She smelted it in a crude clay crucible, drawing it into fine wire. She used acidic fruit juice as an electrolyte to clean the contacts. It was Stone Age circuitry. It was impossible. It shouldn't work. But on the day of the summer solstice, it did. She connected the copper wire to the resonator and angled the shard to catch the midday sun, using the photons to jumpstart the piezoelectric array. A hum filled the air. It wasn't the buzz of an insect. It was the pure, mathematical tone of high-tech machinery. The core lit up. A holographic projection flickered into existence above the rock, jagged, static-filled, but legible. Temporal lock acquired. Beacon active. Extraction window, 4 hours. Coordinates, local. Elena stared at the blue light. It was the color of her lab, the color of New Berlin's neon rain. "I did it," she whispered. She sank to her knees. The relief was overwhelming. She could go back. Hot showers, antibiotics, pizza, the sum of human knowledge at her fingertips. No more sleeping on furs, no more fearing the winter. She reached out to touch the confirmation node. Then she heard a sound. It was laughter, drifting up from the valley floor. She crawled to the edge of the cliff. Below, the village was alive. Children were splashing in the river, the clean water she had given them. The hunters were returning with an elk. She saw Tor. He was teaching a young boy how to hold a spear. He threw his head back and laughed at something the boy said. Elena's hand froze over the hologram. The beacon was silent to them, but to the Temporal Integrity Commission, it was a flare. If she confirmed the signal, a retrieval pod would manifest within hours. They would snatch her up. And then, Protocol 7 Contamination Containment. If a traveler heavily altered a timeline, the Commission didn't just extract the traveler. They sanitized the site. They would erase the anomalies. The water filters, the smoked meat, the new hunting tactics. Maybe even the people who remembered her. No, Elena breathed. Chapter 24, The Ghost of the Future. She sat on the cliff for an hour, the hologram pulsing beside her. She closed her eyes and tried to summon the face of Marcus. It was blurry. She tried to remember the smell of her apartment. It smelled of ozone and recycled air. It smelled lonely. She looked at her hands. They were stained with ochre and dirt. They were scarred. They were strong. She thought of the future she was returning to. A world of comfort, yes, but a world where she was an observer. A woman who lived in the past through books, terrified of the present. Here she was the variable. She was the fire bringer. She heard footsteps behind her. Elena spun around, hand going to her knife. It was Tor. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the blue hologram. He didn't look terrified. He looked resigned. "The spirit light," he said softly. "It's a door, Tor," Elena said, her voice cracking. "A door to my home." Tor walked closer. He looked at the shimmering letters floating in the air. He couldn't read them, but he understood their geometry. It was the geometry of the stars. "You fixed it," he said. "Yes." "So you go." He didn't ask her to stay. He was a hunter. He knew you couldn't trap a hawk and expect it to be happy. Elena stood up. "If I go, I can never come back, and you become a story I read in a book." Tor reached out. He didn't touch the hologram. He touched her face. "We are all stories, Elna," he said. "Some are short, some are long, but the story is good." He pulled his hand away. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her the choice. "The sun is high," he said. "The window is open." "Yes." "Then choose." He turned around. He walked to the edge of the cliff and sat down, his back to her. He was watching the village. He was watching the life they had built. Elena looked at his broad back. She looked at the hologram. "Confirm extraction. Y/N. She imagined the extraction team. They would appear in sterile white suits. They would treat Tor like a specimen. They would treat her like a victim. I am not a victim, she thought. I am a survivor. She looked at the village below. The smoke from the fires she had helped build curled into the sky. This wasn't just history, it was her life. Chapter 25, The River. Elena Voss reached into the hologram. Her finger hovered over the Y. I'm sorry, Marcus, she whispered, but you were right, time is a waterfall. She moved her finger. She pressed N. A boarding signal. Purging LOGS. System shut down. The blue light flickered. The hum rose in pitch, then cut off with a sharp snap. The hologram vanished. The core went dark, turning back into a piece of dull, lifeless metal. Elena picked up the core. It was heavy. She walked to the edge of the cliff, standing beside Tor. He didn't look up. He was bracing himself for the sound of the sky tearing open. Tor, she said. He flinched. Stand up. He stood, turning to face her. His eyes were wet. Elena held out the core. It's heavy, she said. Tor looked at the dead machine. He looked at the empty air where the blue light had been. The door, he asked. Closed, Elena said, locked from the inside. She wound up and threw the core. It sailed out over the canyon, spinning end over end. It glittered in the sun one last time before it plummeted into the river far below. Splash. The current took it. It would be buried in silt, ground down by rocks, lost to the ages. Maybe, in 12,000 years, an archaeologist would find a strange lump of fused alloy and wonder what it was. But they would never know. Tor grabbed her. He buried his face in her neck, letting out a shuddering breath that broke her heart and mended it all at once. You stay, he choked out. I stay, she promised. She took his hand. They looked down at the kraal. They will need more wood for the winter, she said, her voice steady, practical. And we need to reinforce the eastern traps. Tor laughed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, he said, work. Work, she agreed. They turned and began the descent down the winding path. Dr. Elena Voss was dead. She had died in a flash of blue light on a mountainside. Elna of the kraal walked down the mountain to the sound of drums. The sun was warm on her face. The smell of wood smoke rose to meet her. She was home,